That's great. Ending on the point of connection leads perfectly into what I'm about to talk about. So, my name is Christine McLaren. I am the Director of Research and Partnerships for Happy City, which began as a book and is now an organization that helps people like you and people around the world implement ideas of happiness into their work in urban design. And we work a lot with health and policy, health researchers and health policy people as well, because as you'll see in this presentation, there is so much intersection. First, there's often this expectation when I go and give talks that you're the happy city person, you're going to come and you're going to make us all happy. So I like to sort of shirk that responsibility by starting out with a really sad story. And some of you may remember this. This is a photo of Chicago in 1995. And in 1995, as you may remember, there was a heat wave that hit the US Midwest and central Canada, and Chicago was hit particularly hard. Roads buckled, apartments baked, people pried open fire hydrants and threw rocks at the crews who tried to stop them. By Saturday, July 13th, the thermometer read 107 in the shade. Over 700 people died over 3 days in that heat wave. So many people died that the city had to rent refrigerated trucks to carry the dead away. Now, at the time, there was a young researcher at the Centers for Disease Control named Jan Semenza, a young epidemiologist. And the CDC sent him out to Chicago to find out what it was that had connected these people who had died. What did they have in common? So Jan went to Chicago, and he had his list of people who had died during this heat wave, and he went to the first address on the list. And he went in, it was a residential hotel. He went in, he said it was like going into the belly of hell. There was sweat pouring down his face, it was hot. He went to the residential hotel manager, and he said, he inquired after this man who had died. And he said, can you point me to anybody that he knew? Did you know anything about him? He said, no, I didn't know anything about him. Can you point me to anybody that he knew? And he said, no, he didn't really have any visitors. Semenza said, what are you talking about? Of course, he must have had visitors. Did he have family or friends? And he sort of prodded this guy for a while, and finally the manager said, no, look, you don't get it. This guy had nobody. He was a nobody. He had nobody. He was a nobody. And Semenza, he thought this was terrible. What a horrible thing to say about somebody. So he went to the next address, and he went to the next address, and to the next address, and to the next address, and over and over and over, he heard the same story. There were lots of things that connected the people who had died in that heat wave. Many were poor, many didn't have air conditioning, but overall, they had one thing in common: social isolation. The dead were alone in the world. So Semenza kind of left Chicago pretty devastated, wondering, oh God, is there an antidote to this disconnected city? And we're going to come back to that at the end. And for now, I'll get out of the sad story and go in a little bit to the science. So we met Semenza during the many years that we spent exploring the link between urban design and what some might call the science of happiness. And Semenza's story really matters because it holds the key to the clues of the puzzle of urban well-being. And before I explain that connection, I'd like to step back a second and just sort of look at the bigger picture. Our research has convinced us that the way we design our cities can make or break human happiness. That means that we must be mindful of the power that urban design holds. And we need to use this knowledge to consciously repair the damage that we have done in our cities and to build happiness into new places. But before we get into that, the question is really, why should cities make us happy? It's not actually just us that have argued this. We've been talking about this for thousands of years. Aristotle argued for it back in ancient Athens. But increasingly over the past several decades, psychologists, neuroscience, sociologists, public health researchers, people who we all listen to a lot more than we do to philosophers these days, have come up with an evidence-based understanding of happiness that explains why it matters beyond being a goal in and of itself. And there are some key things that we have learned about happiness over the years. One of them is that, generally speaking, happy people are happy. It sounds like a bit of a no-brainer, but it's actually true. People who say they're happy tend to have it reflected in their bodies. They have more activity, for example, in the pleasure centers of their brain. These people also have lower levels of stress hormones in their blood. They're less likely to check themselves into a hospital or to die by suicide. They're less likely to get a cold, they're more productive at work, they live longer, and they tend to be healthier. So we're not just talking about happiness for the sake of happiness. Happy people tend to live better lives all around. So, Aristotle was right. Happiness, generally speaking, it's a good thing. It's a worthy value to pursue. But what makes us happy? Obviously, my happiness is going to be different from your happiness. Everybody's happiness looks different. But there are some things that we all share in common. And so here's a quick list that we drew from some of the disciplines that I mentioned. This is pretty obvious. I'm sure that most of you know this. Food, security, shelter, those are the basics. We have to have those covered. We're not going to be happy if we're hungry, if we don't have a place to live, or we're not safe. We need to experience more pleasure than pain. Sounds pretty simple, but there's more to it than that. Security, we need to be safe. We need to have a safe place to raise our families. We also need to have a sense of mastery. We need to be able to feel like we can get through the day without the world or our city beating us down, that we have a sense of control over our environment and our lives. We need to be healthy. Everybody in this audience knows that better than I do. Wealth. This is a tricky one. It does matter. You also probably know this. But when we're looking at, it is, generally speaking, better to be rich than it is to be poor. But when we're looking at societal happiness, what we're actually talking about is equity. Even baboons that sit at the bottom of a social divide where there are better baboons and less better baboons that have high status and low status, they also get sicker more often. It's terrible for all of us when there is a divide in equity. We need to have a sense of meaning in our lives, a sense that what we're doing in our life matters. But more than anything, the glue that ties all of this together is social ties. Social ties are the key ingredient to human happiness. Excuse me. And social connections, they do more than just cheer us up. This is going to sound familiar. The more connected we are with family and friends, the less likely we are to experience colds, heart attack, cancer, depression. Connected people sleep better at night. They're more able to tackle adversity. They're more productive. They live longer, as Jan saw in Chicago. It's almost the exact same list as happy people. So what I'm getting at is that research shows us overwhelmingly that the more connected people are with their community, the happier they are and the better lives they live all around. The happy city and the social city are the same place. Now, this is all well and good, but our social worlds actually don't happen by accident, although we would really like to believe that, I think, sometimes. In their architecture, their forms, public spaces, transportation systems, cities have a profound effect on trust, sociability, and well-being. And this could be a much longer talk. Like I said, it's an entire book. It's available upstairs. But I'm just going to go through a few of these realms in this talk today. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about architecture. This is a great story. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia. And in Vancouver, we have a form that we ever so humbly like to call, a form of architecture that we ever so humbly like to call Vancouverism, which is essentially what you see here. It is a podium, a 3 to 4 story podium on the bottom of a very tall tower that is set back. So when you're on the street, you kind of feel like you're standing next to a 4-story building, where in reality, somewhere in the back, there's like a 30-story tower in the background. So we met, this is a project called the 501. It was a very typical Vancouverist tower project. And, but this one was a little bit special. There was the tower of condo buildings, and then at the bottom of the podium tower on the 3rd story, there were a bunch of townhouses. And all these townhouses faced in towards a central courtyard. This is the central courtyard that you're seeing here. It's got a volleyball net, as you can see, and there are 12 units that face towards this third story podium garden, it's called. And we met a guy named Rob who had moved into the 501. When he originally moved there, he bought a condo in the tower. You know, the utmost status symbol in Vancouver. You own a condo with beautiful wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, and he loved it. He said that when he was up there, he felt like he was floating above the clouds. And he invited all of his friends over to see his beautiful view. It was a fairly small apartment, so they couldn't stay too long, and then they left. And he found himself looking down at this podium garden where all of these families who were living in these townhouses were playing volleyball with each other. And he started to feel kind of lonely. And eventually, it started getting to him so much because he would go out in his hallway, he wouldn't see any of his neighbors. You know, maybe he saw them in the elevator, but it was a really awkward kind of way to talk to people, so he wouldn't have any connection with them. And he saw these families down below. They're like breaking out the barbecue, they're roasting chicken. One of them's like going off with the other person's kids because they're going to babysit them for the night. There were rumors that they were going on holidays together. And finally, he sold his condo and he bought one of those townhouses. And we asked him, several years later after he had done this, we asked him, you know, Rob, how many of your neighbors do you know now? And he said, well, I know all of them. And we said, how many of your neighbors do you love? And he's like, 7? Which is pretty remarkable considering that the average American has 1.5 people in the world that they say they can trust with a secret. So there was something really special about the way that this third-story podium garden was designed. These townhouses, they had you know, front doors that faced out onto the garden, but they also had these porches and these stairs that were this sort of, that was this sort of soft space between public and private, which meant that you could have these casual interactions with your neighbors. You weren't forced to go into their house or come right into public space. So that was one thing that had a major influence. And this has been shown over and over. For example, Jan Gehl, the famous urban designer from Copenhagen, has said that the ideal front yard space for social activity is 10.6 feet. Because of that, it's a little bit specific, and I have measured. I have lived in a house like that, and I can tell you my social life was much better when I lived in that house with a wonderful porch right off the bike route. But what it means is that you have a lot more control. It's that mastery piece that we were talking about over your interactions. It also has something to do with group size. When you are in a tower podium, you have no idea which one of your 1,500 neighbors you're going to get shuttled into an uncomfortably small space, into the elevator with, and therefore you end up retreating. So architecture, how can it influence us? Giving us places to retreat or to go out into public as we wish. Here's another glaring example. Let's look at commuting, everybody's favorite topic. This is one very, very glaring example. Studies of commuters show that the longer you drive in a car, the less happy you are. Now, you might think, well, duh, nobody likes being, stuck in traffic. There were probably many people who were stuck in traffic on their way here, and they probably didn't feel very good about that. But one thing to think about is that this study was not asking how happy people were with their commute. They were asking how happy people were with their lives in general. We have a tendency to vastly overestimate the psychological benefits of a big house or a better job where we make more money. When people choose a longer drive to work, either to enjoy the benefits of that bigger house or a higher paying job, most of the time it doesn't compensate. Why? Because we get used to material acquisitions, but we don't get used to the constantly changing irritation of driving in traffic. And most of all, we don't get used to the pain of no time with our family and friends. So it isn't just because driving is stressful, which it is. Studies show your cortisol levels are considerably higher when you're driving in traffic, which I'm sure that resonates with all of you. But we're also antisocial when we drive. Literally, when we're trapped in our cars without that face-to-face contact, we are considerably more likely to experience rudeness. The Vancouver Sun, where, again, the newspaper where I live, reported a few years ago that people were more than twice as likely to experience rudeness while they were driving than even while taking transit. And I'm talking like twice as, 24 versus 43%. And everyone here knows probably how much you want to be rude when you're taking public transit. I certainly do. Researchers have found that a person with a 1-hour commute has to earn 40% more money to be as satisfied with life as somebody who walks to work. For a single person, exchanging a long commute for a short walk has the same effect on happiness as finding new love. And a Swedish study also found that people with a 45-minute commute or more are more than 40% more likely to get divorced. These are not numbers that I'm making up. These are peer-reviewed studies. So, people who are living out there in sprawl are they're less likely to eat with their family. They're less likely to vote, to volunteer, and trust people as people who are living out there in walkable communities. Now, why is this the case? Okay, this is a very scary graph, and I don't have very much time, so I'm not going to talk about it too much because it gets into the space-time continuum, which I know sounds like a little bit much maybe for a talk about urban planning. But what you need to know about this graph is that it charts something called social interaction potential. What that means basically is that if you live so say you want to meet up with a friend for a beer after or an ice cream after work. And you live at home A and you work at home B, or at work A, your friend lives at home B and works at work B. And if you want to get together after work, you can graph this all, and you have to travel across space and you have to travel across time. And in order for you to meet up, your space-time graphs need to intersect. And basically, the further apart those points are on the graph, the smaller the intersection point is, and that means the less likely the chance that you will actually be able to connect. Which means that the biggest limiting factor to face-to-face interaction in our cities is dispersal, otherwise known as sprawl. The degree to which activities and the population are separated across the miles. So, in short, the more sprawling your city is, the less likely you are to meet up with friends, which is very unfortunate considering that 70 to 80% of places in the last 20 years that have been built have looked like this, where communities, every destination is far from every other destination. You live in the top corner, you work in the other corner, you go shopping down there, and your kids' tap dance lessons are in the other corner. That's a lot of driving. It's totally car dependent. And this doesn't just affect the space-time continuum, it affects everything. So over here we have a very car-dependent neighborhood, here a very walkable neighborhood. This is in Atlanta, Georgia. People in that car-dependent neighborhood, they emit 2 times more greenhouse gases than those who live in the walkable neighborhood. They're more than 10 pounds heavier on average. They die 3 to 5 years sooner for lack of physical activity. They spend more than 2 times more money getting around. These are very expensive places to live. It's not a coincidence that the places that were hit hardest by the recession in 2008 were those that were the most car dependent. On average, you have to own 1 more car to live in a place like this, which means $500 to $800 more per family per month. That's a lot of money that could otherwise be going into education, into health, or into social activities. But the most important thing is that these places, generally speaking, are considerably less social and are less trusting. And that is the real crisis. So let's move from commuting, and we'll talk about aesthetics, just what your city looks like. What is it, what do your street facades look like? How would that actually impact your happiness? Well, we did this is very interesting. So we worked on this crazy project called the BMW Guggenheim Lab, which we like to call the Guggenheim Lab, in New York City several years ago. And it was this crazy mobile urban think tank where we worked with researchers from all over the world to do all sorts of tests and workshops and studies and crazy stuff like that. One of the things that we did is we collaborated with a researcher named Dr. Colin Ellard, an environmental psychologist and neuroscientist. And we created a walking tour through Manhattan where people had their skin conducted. They had skin conductance to measure their arousal, not sexual arousal, but just general state of arousal. And they also had these hacked Blackberries where they could type in the emotions that they were experiencing as they were moving through the city. And one of the things, this was the walking tour here, and one of the things that they found is that people were considerably happier on this kind of jumbled up, old, crappy, messy block as they were in front of this big, beautiful, slick, blank facade. Now, this shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. Urban developers have been talking about this for quite some time. William H. White did, and so did Jan Gale, do studies on this that found that people were less likely to stop and mingle or even take a phone call in front of a building that looked like this versus a building that looked like this. They're just generally speaking more antisocial places. Another example of this is there was a study that was done in the top in Montreal and the bottom in Winnipeg, where they found that people were considerably more likely to walk to their destination on a street facade that looked like the one at the top as in the one on the bottom. So even though, I mean, Montreal is a place it's very cold in the winter, it's very hot in the summer, it's sweat-soaked. People would walk up to 800 meters to go to a shop along a street that looked like that. Whereas if you dump them down in this power center down at the bottom in Winnipeg, which has equally cold winters and hot summers, they wouldn't endure as much as a 3-minute stroll from store to store. They would actually get in their cars and drive from one store to the other. In fact, most customers parked their cars 3 times in one visit at that power center. This was reflected in a project that we did in Seattle, where we called it the lost tourist, or the deer in the headlights experiment, where we planted a fake lost tourist on this streetscape right here and this streetscape right here. So a very active, lively facade and a very blank facade. And that person was holding a map, and they were asking for help, asking for directions, as well as to use a cell phone to call and find the people that they were supposed to meet. And what we found was really fascinating, and this hasn't yet been scaled up to be peer reviewed, but what we found was fascinating. The people who were standing on the active facade were considerably more likely to receive help from a stranger. So strangers were actually considerably more willing to be helpful and kind to this person in front of an active facade as they were in front of a blank facade, which is really quite striking. So I mean, the point is that the way that we build our environments has a drastic impact on how we live and how we move and how we feel. And if you build the type of city that makes us more likely to be social, you accidentally also happen to be building the city that is more walkable, it's more bikeable, it's lower carbon, and generally speaking, it's healthier. Not just because those people are happier and more socially connected, which we've shown has a profound impact on health, but also because they're more likely to get exercise and to be going around in their communities and making those social interactions in the first place. They live better lives all around. So I'm going to tie off here. I can't leave you hanging with the story with Jan Semenza, where he left Chicago feeling a little bit depressed, looking for that antidote to the disconnected city. A few years later, he settled in Portland, Oregon. He took a teaching job at Oregon State University, and the neighborhood that he moved into had a lot of problems. It had open drug use, prostitution, crime. People were like defecating in his backyard. And there was very low trust as a result. But he came across this neighborhood in another part of town that had turned their intersection into a public piazza. They had come together, and it's on Sherritt Street, so they call it Sherritt Square, which is a little bit Portlandia, but whatever. To each his own. But every year the whole neighborhood got together, and they would come up with a design and they would paint the intersection. And you can see in the corner there's this little hippie tea stand that always has a container of hot water on it, so you can always make yourself a cup of tea. Some more Portlandia things like that. But a really important note was that Portland was hit particularly hard by the recession. The employment rate was 12%. But the people who lived around this square, they weren't anxious. In fact, there was a kid that came up to us while we were there, and he said to us, I kid you not, we're all villagers now, and we help each other out in hard times. There was a lady, for example, who came home one day, and her neighbors had painted her house. And so Semenza thought that this was really spectacular, so he decided to do it himself. So he got his neighbors together in his neighborhood and eventually convinced them to do this. There were all sorts of arguments that resulted. You know, there was for some reason, the honeysuckle was very controversial, whether or not there should be honeysuckle or not. But they finally came to a plan, and they went out and they did it. But something that you should know before you're sort of like, okay, this is a little hippy flippy. Why are you telling me about this? Semenza is like a compulsive researcher. So he and his students went out and they studied the impact of this, what they call intersection repair. And what he found was that they had found this blast radius of happiness around each intersection repair that had happened. But he also found that crime had gone down, depression had gone down, fear had gone down, people were happier, they were healthier, social capital was up. People knew their neighbors better. They helped them more often. They started sharing more, so they were saving money. It was so effective that Semenza went on to publish a publication that suggested that this could be a climate change mitigation strategy. So when it came time for, they had this gazebo that they wanted to build, and when it came time to put this gazebo up, some guy had a backhoe in his backyard, and he's like, oh, I'll go get that. And Semenza was like, no, this is something we have to do together. So they all lifted the gazebo up and they put it up together. And that, I think, is the point that I'd like to end on, which is that, yes, it is the responsibility of our traffic engineers and our architects and our city planners and our politicians and designers to do things better, but we can also make that change ourselves. And at the end of the day, the happiest city will be the one that we build together. So the happy city is a healthy place, it's a sustainable place, it's a wealthy place, but above all, it is a social place. We can plan for happiness, we can zone for happiness, and we can build for happiness, but we have to build it together. Thank you.